What's up, guys? This is Patrick Hall with fstoppers.com. Today we are in Zion National Park in Utah. We're actually about to hike up to Angel's Landing, this big mountain behind me, and what I've been told is it's one of the most dangerous, scary hikes you can do in America. It takes about 2 hours to get to the top, and because of that, we're not going to carry any cameras. We're going to take a couple point and shoots, some iPhones, and then I'm going to strap a GoPro high above me on a backpack so you can get the first-person perspective of doing one of the most dangerous climbs in America. Aliyah is going to take a photograph with the new Fuji medium format camera, and then when we're all done, Aliyah is going to take you into the post-processing studio where he's going to show you how he edits his photos to produce a world-class landscape photograph. So let's get up on the trail. It's about a 2-hour hike, and let's see how dangerous this hike really is. This is the one everyone comes here for. The Angel's Landing. Warning. Don't jump kick off the side of the mountain.
Alright, so here's the path. This is where we're going. You might be able to see some people up there. But to get there, that is what we're doing.
Oh, you can see the little people up there.
Yeah, you can see them. Let's do it. Patrick's got his GoPro setup going, but we haven't made it to the chains yet. All right, so I just made it to a part that kind of feels like, okay, we've made it to the end. This thing's over. It is not over. Look at this. It goes all the way from here, all the way up, and then across the top of this thing. Chains the entire way. This is the coolest hike I've ever done by far, by far.
This area around Angel's Landing was one of the most beautiful views I've seen in North America. As a landscape photographer, I always like to carry my camera with me no matter where I go. While Lee and Patrick were relying on their iPhones, I hiked up with my Fujifilm GFX 50S camera and the 23mm lens. Even though this hike was challenging, I didn't want to miss any opportunities to capture a great photo.
Halfway done.
All right, here we go. Time to do the spine. Let the fun begin.
So you get to places like this where you can only go one way, so I'm having to wait here so that I have a lot more to go to.
The best views up ahead.
The best views up ahead, okay. This never makes you feel good when you're putting all of your faith in the chains and you're like laying off a cliff and then it just pulls out. Oh my gosh.
at this.
Oh my god.
Let me see if you can see where everyone else is going down. How high this is. Oh boy. That makes me a little nervous. I don't like that.
Alright. I have made it to the top. Just can walk over there, see the lookout point, and here is the amazing view. I think I'm gonna set up a time lapse.
One wrong move and you're not on Angel's Landing anymore.
Maybe that's why it's called Angel's Landing.
So we did take a lot of breaks and I took time lapses along the way. I think it took us about 2 hours and 15 minutes, maybe 2 hours. So a little bit slower than we expected. This is probably the best view I've ever seen in real life in my whole life. I think I've seen something kind of like this in Interlaken, Switzerland, but I had no idea that there was stuff like this in America. I just had no idea. So this is officially the end. You can see people have made all these little stacks. And the sun is just barely peeking over the mountain. We're about to lose it. So this is like the ultimate time right now to be taking pictures and time lapses.
All right, so this is a bonus tutorial if you're seeing this. We just hiked to the top of Angel's Landing in Zion. I actually brought the Fujifilm GFX 50S up here. If you're gonna do a hike of this intensity, I would recommend a smaller camera. But I really wanted to get up here and see the shot. We researched it, and I mean, seeing it online, it already looks incredible, but actually getting to climb up here, you have to take all of these chain paths. They have these chains set up so that you can actually pull yourself up the rock, and it's like 1,000 or 2,000 foot drop on either side. It's really amazing. So it was worth taking the gear up here. And we thought, you know, we might film a lesson up here, but we decided to leave all the microphone stuff behind. So we're filming it on 2 iPhones, no microphone gear, so much lighter than usual. And we didn't even plan to have a lesson, but we're going to do it anyway because we're about to pack it up before we have to go down in the dark. So basically, I'm shooting with the fixed 18 millimeter equivalent. I'm shooting in f8, very simple 3 exposure brackets, -2, -1, and 0. I've positioned myself on this really sort of dodgy decline edge here because I wanted to be able to see over the edge and not have any rocks in the foreground. Composition is pretty straightforward. Getting up here in the late afternoon, the light was hitting the left side, the tops of the mountains. I set this to an interval timer and then went over there to do a bunch of selfies. So I just came back, and what I'm hoping is at a 3-minute interval, I was able to capture enough light to blend the last light on the tops of the mountains on the left with some of this slightly now starting to turn yellow sky. So that's the hope. I have no idea if this is going to work. It's one of those things that you're up here, it looks incredible, but when you get it all into post, it can tend to look a little bit flat because we're looking at miles and miles in the distance there. So I don't know if any of this is going to turn out. It might look ultra boring, but I'm going to take it into Photoshop anyway. And right now we have to pack up really quick because that sun is going to set in about 20 minutes, and then we have a 2-hour climb to get down, and I don't want to be doing that in the dark.
Welcome to the post-processing studio, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at the image I captured when we got to the top of the Angel's Landing hike. Planning this hike, the intention actually never was to really film a lesson, but when we got up to the top, we'd already filmed so much beautiful B-roll, and Patrick with his crazy contraption to actually film the fisheye view looking down, that we decided to try to do a lesson at the very top. But the thing was, the light was kind of already faded, and I wasn't really happy with the shot. We needed to be up there a little bit earlier so I could catch the last light on the mountains, and I would have needed a little bit more time to scout the top, figure out some good foreground composition, and different things like that. So the shot itself is very cool. It's definitely a beautiful view, and if you ever make it out there, I definitely encourage you guys to actually go and do this hike. But as a whole, it's definitely not a portfolio piece. So I decided to incorporate this as some bonus content, because throughout this entire tutorial, Photographing the World 4, we're doing everything without relying on any third-party plugins. But that doesn't mean I don't use third-party plugins, and that doesn't mean that I want to discourage you from using them. These days I use a combination of Nik Collection and Skylum Luminar. Now, if you remember back to Photographing the World 1 and 2, I was using Nik Collection when Google owned it. A little while after that, Google discontinued it, and everybody kind of panicked and thought it was going to go away. And that's a legitimate concern. We never know if software is going to go away. That's why I like to rely on Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Lightroom, because I know Adobe is going to continue those products, hopefully, forever. But what happened was DxO Optics actually bought Nik Collection and recently re-released it so it works with Lightroom and Photoshop again. And hopefully they continue to tweak it and make it available for us for years to come. And while this tutorial is really going to focus just on manual blending techniques using Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom, I'm still going to put a lesson in here or there that's going to explain the plugins. So what we're going to actually do here is just quickly edit this photo in Lightroom. We're going to bring it into Photoshop. And what I want to do is show you the tools that I use in Nik Collection in Color Efex Pro specifically, the filters that I think are the best for landscape photography. If you're already familiar with Nik Collection, then this will be a little bit of a review, but if you've never used it before, I encourage you to check it out, download the trial, and see if you like it. Let's take a look at our file inside of Lightroom. Let's just go ahead and zero out this sharpening. This is shot with the GFX 50S medium format camera, and it's still a little dark. Let's go ahead and bring the exposure up so we can start to see it. So we'll go ahead and bring the exposure up. Let's bring the shadows up a little bit, maybe 50. Let's bring the highlights down to get the sky back, maybe 50 as well. And it feels a little flat. We can actually change it to Adobe Landscape and kind of pop those colors out. We should also go into the sky and sort of ramp this down just a little bit. So shadows by default, 25, that's fine. And let's do negative 25 in the highlights as well. Everything looks nice and balanced. Let's go ahead and export this into Photoshop. Before we go any further, let's go back to Lightroom. I'm going to reset this and export it again so we can begin our build. Select all, copy, close, paste. Let's go ahead and call this Edited Raw and Original Raw. And of course, we'll swap the order of this, save it in the background. I'll select Edited Raw, go up to Filter, and you can see these are the only two filter plugin packages that I use. Under Nik Collection, Color Efex Pro. All right, so here on the left, I've actually already selected my favorites. You can see there are tons of things here: black and white conversion, bleach bypass, soft focus. There's so many different things for so many different genres and styles of photography. But for me, these are my favorites, and these are the ones that I use constantly in landscape and cityscape photography. Brilliance and warmth, contrast color range, polarization, pro contrast, tonal contrast, and white neutralizer. Let's go ahead and start with an overview here. I'll start with pro contrast, which is by far the one I use the most. And it's pretty simple here. We have correct color cast, correct contrast, and dynamic contrast. And when I correct color cast, it's going to do a full read of the image, and it sort of just shifts your white balance a little bit. So in this case, not super dramatic. Off to the right, it's putting a little bit more green shift in the bottom, a little bit warmer, and taking some of the magenta and the blue out, which is actually pretty cool. It does a good job of figuring out how to rebalance your color correction or your white balance. So that's pretty straightforward. Correct contrast tries to pull the edges here and here of the histogram to try to rebalance the contrast. In other words, if you're missing gaps here on the histogram, it's going to kind of straighten those out. So you can see as I do that, it's going to stretch it. And it's also going to start to blow out values both in the blacks and in the whites. Unlike correct contrast, dynamic contrast preserves the whites and the blacks and adds contrast in the midtones. So it can give your image a little bit more pop. Throughout this tutorial, we're going to be doing this using a midtones luminosity mask and a couple other different methods. But this is a really fast way to get dynamic contrast. And it's named perfectly because that's exactly what it's giving you. So using a combination of these, you can quickly adjust the color. And you'll know pretty quickly whether you like this effect or not. And then we can adjust the contrast, give this image just a little bit more pop, and then we can do the dynamic contrast and really start to pull out those midtones. And it can be fairly dramatic. Now you can add as many of these as you want. And to add another filter, you click on Add Filter, and off to the left, let's do another one. Let's do polarization. Polarization, I would say, is good for skies. And if I leave the rotate to 105 degrees, which is the default, and I change the strength, notice how the sky gets much more contrasty. Now that's similar to what a polarizer would do in a sky, but I never use a polarizer in the field to change the color of the sky. In a future lesson in this series, we're actually going to use a polarizer the right way to get rid of a reflection on the water. And that being said, you can't use a slider like this to get rid of a reflection that's there in the water. So there are good times to use a polarizer and bad times. But for the most part, this is kind of a color correction. And you can see it really does a good job adding contrast to the sky. So I like to do that just to bump the contrast in the sky without having to use a pro or tonal contrast. Let's add another one. Brilliance and warmth, very useful. Saturation should be self-explanatory. Warmth, again, warmth are cool, and we can add a little bit globally to the image, just a little bit of warmth, 12, 13%. You can see that it'll really start to stack up quite a bit later. The other slider here is perceptual saturation. This is kind of like a vibrance. It works on the surrounding colors. So when saturation is kind of global, saturates everything, it's interesting because perceptual, let me just go ahead and reset that, perceptual will actually work on the tone surrounding. So if I do this really extreme, you can see that it's cutting out all of these different points of saturation. This orange separated from this light yellow to these actual greens and cyans that were actually in the rock. So a tiny little bit of perceptual saturation is very similar to using vibrance in Adobe Lightroom. So we can add a little bit to that in a global fashion. Just a little bit of that. We'll get rid of this and we'll do that later selectively. Let's add one more, and I want to use the white neutralizer. By default, it's going to go with a yellow tone, but I want to get rid of this atmospheric perspective here. See the blue in the image? And if I click that, what I'm doing is sampling that color. If I turn it off, you can see the before and after. Obviously, I don't want to take the blue out of the sky. So what I want to cover here is the control point selection. So these control points are actually called U points, and they allow us to quickly add an area that we want to include just by clicking and clicking again on the image. And it's really easy. And as I move this around, you can see it's going to live update in that area. That's actually kind of cool. These U points are really powerful. If I expand this, click on the mask icon, you can see exactly how these work. So it's really useful, really easy to isolate different areas. You can see if I wanted to just isolate that blue. With that, I can also change the radius and the opacity of it. The other thing I can do is isolate it in specific areas. So if I added or subtracted, in this case, another area around here, you can see it's going to keep this even more isolated. But right now, click on this, and we'll go ahead and hide these and toggle this on and off, and you can see that I'm neutralizing this entire area. Now that's too much. I don't want to do too much. Neutralize is basically desaturate. Adjust is going to fill a cold tone with a warm tone to try to compensate. So I'm going to get this to be about where I want it, and I'll scale this up a little bit. And I'm also going to subtract the cloud line right here. And you can see now I have just the area of the horizon, and we're going to subtract a little bit more of the clouds. If we look at the mask, that looks pretty good. All right, so we're able to neutralize the whites. Now this works with blue. This works really good in cityscape photography too, when we have blue reflections in windows or white objects or any light object that's picking up the blue. We can also expand this if we want to, say, remove blue from this area of the foreground, and you can see how that just brings that right back to life. Same thing down here. If we want to try to remove blue from this part of the foreground, you can see removing blue is going to give us a little bit more of that warmth. So we can just quickly add these in selectively, just like that. And if we go over a little bit, we can always remove them from the sky. So quick before and after with the white neutralizer, that's looking pretty good. Let's add one more. This is actually a fun way to work. We're going to be doing a lot of masking and luminosity blending and different things like that in this tutorial. So it's really cool to be able to do this in a quick fashion. Let's add another brilliance and warmth. And this time I'm going to warm everything up so we can really see that effect quite dramatically. And where I want this to live is just in the valley. So I only want this area in the valley. And maybe down here too, I want to warm this area up just a little bit and expand it up just a little bit like that. And you can see before and after, That looks pretty good. So it's warming everything up. I don't want it to extend too far into these rocks, so I'm also going to add another one of these here and another one of these up here. I want some varying tonality with this warmth. That actually looks pretty nice. I also might want to remove a little bit from back here. Take the opacity down, or up in this case, because it's a negative subtractive mask. We have brilliance and warmth. Perfect. Let's go ahead and add one more. Now this is a very interesting filter, but I do like it. That's contrast color range. By default, it's going to look really bad, probably. So turn the contrast down, and we actually want to change the color contrast here. So by default, it should give you almost no effect, which is fine. But as we start to change the color contrast, you can see it's really trying to pop those varying tones. So it's trying to find areas of contrast in the color, and it allows you to pull that up and create more separation in between. Now obviously turning it all the way up makes it very stylistic. So what I'm going to do is just add a tiny bit, just like this. And I really want this to focus on the sky. I want a little bit more drama in the sky. So once I get this to about 45%, let's go ahead and select the sky. And let's look at the control points, enable the masking, and let's figure out where we want this to be. Now if I want to increase the number of these, I can hold Option and just drag a new one. So I can actually just keep dragging these over. If I create a subtractive one, let's say here, and I'll go ahead and show it, I'll make sure it's shown, I can also Option drag to create more. So we can have this be on the top part of the image and not on the bottom of the image. You can actually have as many of these as you want. So let's go ahead and see that effect. So now we have the contrast on the top of the image. Let's add a little bit more here. That's nice, and a little bit more up here. Let's go ahead and take a look. Perfect. Now I might want to go here, roll this opacity down a little bit, decrease the intensity of the effect, and we'll take a look before and after. So this is looking pretty good. Now it's quite a stack of filters here, so now we can go and clean up some of the in-between. If we want more dynamic contrast in this image, which I definitely think we do, a little bit more of the correction of the contrast. Yeah, just a little bit more contrasty. Color cast is fine. Go into the polarization, see if we need to roll that back a little bit. You can see if I roll that back, it's going to brighten the sky a little bit. We're doing sort of a double thing with the polarization and the contrast color range. Everything else looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and apply the result. Okay, everything applied. Let's examine the result. So before Color Efex Pro and after. That's a really nice difference, actually. And I want to zoom in a little bit here. This plugin package, as well as Skyloom Luminar, they both do an amazing job without causing too many problems, without adding too much noise. I mean, of course, you can add noise if you tweak everything too far. We're going about 25% on the sliders. If you go up to 100%, you're obviously going to get some issues. But everything here doesn't really degrade the quality overall. And if we zoom this out, we can see very quickly, without a single mask, I was able to go from here to here. Now, could we have done a lot of that inside of Lightroom? Maybe warm this up, done some selective editing to bring that out? Of course. Or we can go up here and do this with the Adobe Camera Raw filter. We're going to be using the Camera Raw filter a lot in this tutorial, so I wanted to cover Color Efex Pro here because it's likely we're not going to use it again in the upcoming lessons. This was also meant to just be a quick overview of my favorite options inside of Color Efex Pro. In Photographing the World 1 and 2, I dive into those settings a little bit more extensively. Let's go ahead and see what we started with. Original RAW, really flat, really washed out. Edited RAW, getting there, needs some color and some vibrance, but with the Color Efex Pro layer, you can see we went from there to there. So straight out of camera from here, and just in a few short minutes and no masking, here. And that wraps up this bonus lesson from Angel's Landing. It's time to get back in the field and explore some more beautiful locations.